Well, hello, I'm Doug Apple, back with another special interview for you today. And the announcements and executive orders continue to flow from the White House. And I'll say this, if you're only seeing the knee-jerk headlines, we're going to take just a few minutes to unpack some of what's going on from a biblical Christian perspective. And we have Mike Sharman on the phone line with us. He's an attorney. He's the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. You've heard him here on the Wave 94 airwaves before, but he lives in Virginia, really not all that far from the White House. And so all this stuff coming from the White House, you're right there nearby, Mike. And as a Christian man, a Bible-believing man, a student of the Bible, you can give us some insights, because I know people are just getting knee-jerk reactions from their usual sources. And this is our chance to try to bring some light to these situations. Mike, what do you think?
Well, thanks, Doug, for allowing us to take this time to talk about it, because, so many people have an incorrect view that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, and politics really can't impact us in our Christian life, which is absolutely not true. We've seen over a number of years, during the Obama administration, during the Biden administration, and then in a lot of ways in other administrations, whether they were Republican or Democrat, have really struck to the heart of what is marriage, what is family. Do you have the right to say that a person is a woman or a girl, that a person is a man or a boy if they don't want you to? I mean, there's basic constructs that God has given us. He created us male and female. That's it. Nothing more. There's just, you have two choices, male or female. God had two choices when he created you from conception. Then the first institution that God ever created was the family. And then he created government to protect the family. He created marriage in order to have godly children. I mean, each one of those things are told to us in Scripture, and each of them have been directly attacked by our government. So it's just thrilling that now we have not just a president, but his entire administration, the folks he have around him, who are trying to reinstitute those basic foundations that we've had. We did a barn reconstruction a number of years ago, and the center pillars that were holding up our barn had begun to rot from the bottom up. So because of moisture, termites, etc. So what had to be done? We had to prop up the center beam and then cut off the rotted part and reinsert a good solid part, so that the barn once again would have a solid foundation and wouldn't literally come crumbling down around our heads. Well, if we hadn't had that sort of radical surgical change here in our culture and in our government, our house of our nation would have come crumbling down around our heads very shortly. It was in the process of doing that. So January 28th and 29th, President Trump issued a couple more executive orders that help protect our families and our children primarily. So one of them was called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K through 12 Schooling. Well, isn't that an absolute breath of fresh air just to have an executive order titled that way? And then each executive order has to have a purpose and a policy. So some excerpts from that purpose and policy, that executive order said, in recent years, parents have witnessed schools indoctrinate their children in radical anti-American ideologies while deliberately blocking parental oversight. And then it goes on to say, in many cases, innocent children are compelled to adopt identities as either victims or oppressors solely based on their skin color and other immutable characteristics. In other instances, young men and women are made to question whether they're born in the wrong body and whether to view their parents and their reality as enemies to be blamed. These practices not only erode critical thinking, but also sow division, confusion, and distrust, which undermine the very foundations of personal identity and family unity. But isn't that fantastic that we're having a presidential executive order that notices and states very clearly and succinctly what is the problem that's going on? Now, they don't only point out the problem, but give clear directional statements. The executive order goes on to say, my administration will enforce the order to ensure that recipients of federal funds providing through 12 education comply with all applicable laws prohibiting discrimination in various contexts and protecting parental rights. So they're pointing out that we've already had these laws on the books. They just have either not been enforced or enforced from a distorted perspective. You know, we hear often people say, well, we have Orwellian speak, you know, talking about George Orwell's discussions of that in his books. But the big premise of George Orwell's novels, you know, Animal Farm and 1984 and a number of other essays and works he's done, the big premise was he who controls the language controls the populace. And so that's what we've had for so long, is just our government distorting language, enforcing it upon us, and then making policy from that distortion. So the next section in this executive order of President Trump's was the definitions. And first they say that the definitions that were in the executive order on defending women from gender ideology extremism apply to this also. And then in that order, which we discussed in a prior interview, Doug, defined male and female very clearly, and also said that for this government, and for the federal government, there is going to be only two sexes, male and female, and no gender description shall vary from that. And so in these definitions, it talks about discriminatory equity ideology and defines that as an ideology that treats individuals as members of preferred or disfavored groups rather than as individuals, and minimizes agency, merit, and capability in favor of immoral generalization. So I grew up in the era that Martin Luther King spoke from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. You know, in the era in which civil rights movement was actually existing. You know, a couple of my sisters went down with the Freedom Riders to help with the civil rights movements and marches, and mainly they did daycare for the people who were doing those. So when I was trying to understand as a child, well, what is racism? My dad told me, well, racism is when you're treating people as just part of a group that you either like or dislike, and you don't let them have their identity as an individual. So when I read this definition, my dad's just discussion to me as a child telling me really the most clear definition of racism, you aren't letting them be an individual, stand and fall on their own, as this definition says, merit and capability. It just leaped back to me. That memory came back, and that's what we want, to be treated as an individual. So then they talk about, they define social transitions in this. Means the process of adopting a gender identity or gender marker that differs from a person's sex, using the social transition of bathrooms and lockers that aren't theirs, etc., letting them participate in school athletic competitions that aren't for their actual sex. And so they're distinguishing here in this executive order from social transition, which are those things they are just using the words, distorting the words. And it specifically says this doesn't include the chemical or surgical mutilation. Why did they make that distinction? Well, because that's what's been going on. When we do have the social transition, and then we have the surgical transitions. So in this particular executive order, they're only dealing with the social transition. And then on how to end this, the executive order orders the Secretary of Education, Defense, Health and Human Services, and the Attorney General to provide an ending indoctrination strategy to the President with a plan for eliminating federal funding or support for illegal and discriminatory treatment and indoctrination in K through 12 schools based on gender ideology and discriminatory equity ideology, and protecting parental rights. So that's enormous, because if you look at your public schools budget, a very, very large part of it are actually federal funds. And sometimes the federal funds might actually go to the state as opposed to the county or parish or whichever is the local government institution. But its federal funds come into the public schools, which in large part pays for the school education. So having that huge a purse string club is enormous. So each agency then is supposed to come up with a plan for ending the federal funds for any elementary, secondary school that directly or indirectly supports the social transition of a minor student or deliberately conceals the minor's social transition from the minor's parents. This is a huge revolution for us. Then, one of the other things that I do besides being the legal counsel for Share Healthcare is I also sue child molesters and the people who assist them. And a lot of times that's a principal or somebody else in a public school. And here in this executive order, it says the Attorney General shall coordinate with state attorney generals and local district attorneys in their efforts to enforce the law and file appropriate actions against K-12 teachers and school officials who violate the law by sexually exploiting minors, unlawfully practicing medicine by offering diagnoses and treatment without the requisite license, or otherwise unlawfully facilitating the social transition of a minor student. Well, isn't that encouraging? Because the more that we have sexual permissiveness in a school, the more we reduce those natural boundaries of modesty and the natural understanding of what sex is, then we're opening up the doors. We're essentially grooming children. That sets them up for that sexual abuse that I often have to litigate for a child. Then, as I mentioned in that executive order, it specifically said, well, we're not talking about the chemical or surgical mutilation. But then in another executive order, that addressed exactly that, and it's titled Protecting Children from Chemical and Surgical Mutilation. And isn't that just itself encouraging that we're hearing our president describe these processes not as transitions or helping a child transgender health. He doesn't use any of those inaccurate descriptions. He specifically calls it chemical and surgical mutilation, which is what it is. And that executive order's policy and purpose says across the country today, medical professionals are maiming and sterilizing a growing number of impressionable children under the radical and false claim that adults can change a child's sex through a series of irreversible medical interventions. This dangerous trend will be a stain on our nation's history, and it must end. Here in Virginia, there was a movement in the early part of the 20th century that was sterilizing what that was called defectives. Well, sterilizing people who were in mental institutions, sterilizing people who were in prisons, sterilizing people who were poor, and often they didn't know it. They didn't know that's what was being done to them. Well, that's been a massive stain in Virginia's history. So President Trump is pointing out that this mutilation of children by adults is a dangerous trend that will be a stain on our nation's history, and it must end. It also points out, moreover, these vulnerable youth medical bills may rise throughout their lifetimes, as they are often trapped with lifelong medical complications, a losing war with their own bodies, and tragically sterilization. He goes on to say, accordingly, it's the policy of the United States will not fund, sponsor, promote, assist, or support the so-called transition of a child from one sex to the other, and will rigorously enforce all laws that prohibit or limit these destructive and life-altering procedures. So you notice that it pointed out that these children's medical bills will rise throughout their lifetimes. So you had introduced me as being the legal counsel of Share Healthcare, which is a nonprofit 501c3 Christian ministry. Then its ministry is assisting our members, who are all Christians, to share one another's medically necessary medical bills. So obviously a sexual transition, a sexual mutilation, all of this gender warping thing that's been going on is not medically necessary. In fact, if you're actually using good medicine, it's contradicted by medicine. Well, a lot of times people just wonder, well, how come share healthcare can be so much less expensive than insurance? The average price of health insurance, employer-provided health insurance across the nation for a family of 4 right now is right at $2,600 a month. $2,600 a month. Share healthcare for that same family of 4 is $349 a month. Just one of the small things that goes into that is that we only share in things that are medically necessary and that would not offend God, that aren't contrary to biblical things. Well, within this protecting children from chemical and surgical mutilation, part of it is prohibiting the DOD's money, the Department of Defense's money, from being used to transgender children, to change TRICARE, which is the retirement portion of, with medical people, they often, or military people rather, they'll get TRICARE that they can use as their medical insurance. And it tells them that, you have to stop using TRICARE. It says the Department of Defense provides health insurance through TRICARE to nearly 2 million individuals under the age of 18. The Secretary of Defense shall commence a rulemaking or sub-regulatory action to exclude chemical and surgical mutilation of children from TRICARE coverage and amend the TRICARE provider handbook to exclude chemical and surgical mutilation of children, which tells us it had been paying for it. Our tax dollars, our military tax dollars, had been being used to pay for this chemical and surgical mutilation of children. Then the Director of Personnel Management is supposed to also do the same thing of excluding from the federal employee health benefits packages that same exact thing of excluding from their coverage pediatric transgender surgeries or home arm treatments. We have 2.3 million federal employees with who knows how many children. And again, our tax dollars have been paying for this. As pointed out right at the beginning of this executive order, children who have these transgender mutilations will have a lifetime of medical bill problems. And then they're actually getting to the correct idea of what this is. And the executive order gives a direction to the Attorney General. And it says the Attorney General shall prioritize enforcement of protections against female genital mutilation. Because we have laws on the books against female genital mutilation. And that's exactly what these surgical mutilations are on children, female children who are having these, transgender health care, which is really for a girl, female genital mutilation. And then the Attorney General is also told to prioritize investigations and take appropriate action to end deception of consumers, fraud, and violations of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act by any entity that may be misleading the public about the long-term side effects of chemical and surgical mutilation. Well, thank you. And then if you've heard about some of the news items over the past 2-3 years, a number of schools and school districts and sometimes social service agencies have taken a child and taken them to other states or other counties to have this sexual and surgical mutilation because their parents wouldn't approve of it. Mm-hmm. And California, as an entire state, said it's going to be a sanctuary state for that, as did New Mexico. There might be others, but those are two that just come to mind. So this executive order says the Attorney General is to prioritize investigations and take appropriate action to end child abusive practices by so-called sanctuary states that facilitate stripping custody from parents who support the healthy development of their children, including by considering the application of the Parental Kidnapping Prevention Act and recognizing constitutional right. There's just so much that's sweeping our nation right now, so much positive things. There's coming back to the basic biblical ideas of God created the male and female. God created marriage as his first institution. God created marriage in order to promote the idea of promote having godly children, and then instituted government to protect the family. That's one of its first and basic things.
Yeah, it just feels like a breath of fresh air. And I know that, as I said at the top, a lot of people are seeing these knee-jerk headlines. And you really nailed it when you were talking about George Orwell and talking about who controls the language, because I was a public relations minor in school. And of course, I deal with marketing and advertising, and I see a lot of these things. And I think, wow, they grabbed onto some really nice words and a nice spin to put it on it, but it's covering up the reality of the tragic situations that come from these policies.
Yes, and in 1984, Orwell's books in 1984, there was the Department of History. And one of the main functions of the Department of History was to give people their directions every day on which newspapers and which books to throw down this trash chute that everybody had in their house, to dispose of that knowledge and get rid of that history. Mm-hmm. And it's that which has been going on for a number of years now under the former administration, that they wanted us to just shut our mind to what we know as the basics of life. And unfortunately, so many educated people bought into it.
Yeah.
So talking about education, one of the other executive orders that came out was expanding educational freedom and opportunity for families. So, I appreciate you having me on as the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. And Share Healthcare has the three freedom foundations. We want to promote medical freedom for our members. We want to promote financial freedom, and we want to promote religious freedom. So anybody that's promoting freedom, we are for. And this executive order does that. Now, and I mentioned what we want is a government that assists parents to raise godly children and to raise children who are going to be able to support themselves. Hopefully when our children get to be adults, they are able to act as adults and own their own home, earn a good living, do all those sort of things. But if we aren't educating our children well, that's not going to happen. So the purpose statement in this expanding educational freedom and opportunity for families executive order says, parents want and deserve the best education for their children. But too many children do not thrive in their assigned government-run K-12 school. According to this year's National Assessment of Educational Progress, 70% of 8th graders were below proficient in reading, and 72% were below proficient in math. So let's kind of pause there, rephrase it. Only 30% of 8th graders were proficient on this standard testing, and only 28% were proficient in math. And those tests aren't tough. And proficient doesn't mean excellent.
Right.
Proficient doesn't mean excelling. Proficient just means you're literate. So we have 70% of 8th graders who are not literate. We have 28% of 8th graders who can't do just basic math without having every mistake over the place. So the executive order goes on to say, for this reason, more than a dozen states have enacted universal K-12 scholarship programs, allowing families rather than the government to choose the best educational setting for their children. And so it goes on to say that it wants to spread that. And so it says it's the policy of my administration, said President Trump, to support parents in choosing and directing the upbringing and education of their children. And so then he tells the Secretary of Education to issue guidance on how states can use their federal formula funds to support K-12 educational choice initiatives. And the Secretary of Education shall include educational freedom as a priority in all of its discretionary grant programs. It has a whole block for how to expand the opportunities for low-income working families. And then also, because if you're on a military base in the United States or elsewhere, you're going to go to a military, your child will go to a school that's on that military base, which could be good, could be bad. But you don't have a choice. That's the one that's there. So this executive order says for helping military families, it says within 90 days of the date of this order, the Secretary of Defense shall review any available mechanisms under which military-connected families may use funds from the Department of Defense to attend schools of their choice, including private faith-based or public charter schools. And then it goes on and says the same thing for the kids that are on Indian reservations and are only have the opportunity to go to the Bureau of Indian Education Schools. Again, another fresh breath of fresh air of a president who's saying, you have a whole lot of tax dollars here that are being spent on education, and it's only 30% effective. Mm-hmm. Well, let's at least have these parents have a choice. Maybe it'll stay at the same 30% mark. I doubt that seriously. And this looks toward, it doesn't say within the executive order, but it really is looking toward the statistics that we know from homeschooling. A homeschooling mother who only has a GED or a high school education will teach her children to a point that they score 3 points higher than children who are in a public school being taught by a teacher with a master's. Well, why is that? Here you have a teacher with a master's. She's trained to do it. Mm-hmm. You have all that support. And here's a mom who only has a GED or high school education. How come her kids score better? Well, because she's beginning to focus the educational tools and training, et cetera, precisely on just that child. Mm-hmm. We hear over and over when public schools say they need more money, we want to have a smaller class size. Okay, even a big family will have a smaller class size than the smallest class size in a public school. Mm-hmm. And let's say a mom has 10 children. Well, they're in different grades, et cetera. They can help one another. But that's one mom teaching 10 kids as opposed to a public school teacher in would be a small class of 20 children. Mm-hmm. Well, then all of a sudden that 3-point difference that is higher for homeschoolers makes sense. And so now we're beginning a federal process to work toward giving parents freedoms of what they want to do. You want to homeschool, you want to keep them in your public school that's nearby, you want to put them in a private school, Christian or not. Let's see what we can do to give you your choice.
We already have some of this in Florida, and we had a big showdown on the left of the political spectrum between the teachers' unions and a lot of African-American leaders. And now around here, African-Americans tend to vote Democrat, and the teachers' unions tend to vote Democrat. And so, but you had this showdown because the teachers' unions were especially taking a stand against any moves that Florida was making to offer educational choice like this. But then they ran into this juggernaut of African-American leaders saying, our kids need this.
Absolutely.
And it was, and so because, a house divided can't stand, and there was already this movement towards educational freedom in Florida. And so that's what we currently have.
Right. And that's one of the 12 states that the president is saying is doing things well, and also wants to give you more ammunition, more ability to expand that, because the federal government will be opening up more. Not just the state will, but now the federal government will. Education matters enormously. Mm-hmm. I tell folks often when I'm talking to them about, what you're going to do when you get out of high school, et cetera, is your diplomas that you get or your certificates that you get are the only things that can't be taken away from you. Mm-hmm. You might, through financial turbulence that was nothing of your own doing, you could lose your house, which happened to a whole lot of people in our 2008 and 2009 financial crises, and the mortgages were called, and they had done all the right things at getting their house, and they just lost it through mm-hmm. nothing of their own. And then because they lost a house and had a foreclosure, that changed all their credit. I mean, everything changed, but they still had their degrees. They still had whatever certificate or technical certificate they had.
Yeah.
Education is enormous.
Talking to a young man about, he had dropped out of high school right before graduation for some reason. And I said, you need to get your GED. But I was using this phraseology on him, and that was put a block on a block. Build your life, put a block on a block. And if you get your GED, you are setting a stone. Like you said, nobody can take that away. That is a set stone in your life.
And it's absolutely a building block.
It's a building block. And then
I was 17 when I went into the Army, and I had, at that time, the only grade I completed was 8th grade. And so after I finished basic training and I was in my medic training, I had an afternoon. I went down to our educational office and said, "Can I take the GED test?" "Yeah. Here it is. You want to take it now or later?" I said, "I'll take it now." So I took it, got my GED, and that I will often, if I'm speaking to high school kids or others, I'll say, that's my important degree, my most important degree. Because without my GED, I couldn't have gotten into college. Without my undergraduate, I couldn't have gotten my law degree. Without my law degree, I couldn't have taken the bar, and I couldn't be a lawyer.
Yeah.
And one builds on the other. And it's just so important to do that. But with these educational grants, as you're mentioning, people who had typically been with one party, blacks generally, were at war against others, the unions, because they knew the schools in their areas, the schools that were teaching the kids, it wasn't working, and education is freedom. And, if you read the biographies of Booker T. Washington, one of the big things that was a huge blessing to him and changed his life was one of the blacks who had fought in the Union and then came back to his home, which in Virginia, Booker T. Washington's home area. He was a literate black who then started teaching others. And Booker T. Washington started getting a literacy education from him. And then he was able then to go to the Hampton Institute, which was a college for blacks in Virginia, and train there. And that made all the difference. And he got his training there. Then leaders there heard about a need and wanted him then to go to Tuskegee and start a whole other one down there, which is now the Tuskegee Institute. Education is freedom. And it's just so important that we have that. So here we have this trinity of executive orders that came out January 28th and 29th that will protect our children and also give them freedom.
Well, Mike, we sure appreciate your time. That's Mike Sharman. He's the legal counsel for Share Healthcare. We talked about that very briefly. It's a nonprofit healthcare sharing ministry. If that sounds like it could be the answer for you and your family, check it out at sharehealthcare.com or just call them during regular business hours at 1-844-SHARE-HC. And for Wave 94, I'm Doug Apple.